suggesting that surely there were fatalities, but no one could confirm any. I have spoken to a number of people that I know who pulled people out of rubble. There were severe injuries. There are a number of helicopters here evacuating injured people, and I am told by one senior military source that the plane in the side of the building has been tentatively identified as a Boeing 767, a full-sized airliner, Boeing 767. But that at this point they're waiting for the arrival of a possible second plane, which has been deemed to be a threat, and as I said, fighter jets have been scrambled to address that matter.
Chris, stay with us. That's extraordinary bit of information coming out of Washington now. Let me add to something that we said earlier. We have a report now that a large plane crashed this morning north of the Somerset County Airport, which is in western Pennsylvania, not too terribly far from Pittsburgh, about 80 miles or so. Boeing 767 jet, don't know whose airline it was, whose airplane it was, and we don't have any details beyond that which I have just given you. We don't know if this is somehow connected to what has gone on in New York and Washington, but we do know that another plane has crashed, this one about 80 miles south of Pittsburgh, or at least to the southeast of Pittsburgh. Rose Arce, one of our producers here in New York, joins us on the phone. Rose, what do you have that's new?
Yes, just a while ago, I think you saw that collapse of the top of the World Trade Center. Well, it looks like a large chunk of that debris has hit a building very close by, about 2 blocks away next to an elementary school, causing another explosion. So for the last few minutes, I've been watching people running from that direction. There was one man, I'm not, you saw on the street. I've seen several emergency service workers carrying other emergency service workers from the scene. There's a haze everywhere. It's very, very difficult to see, but there has been the whole area has been covered by soot and ash. So it looks almost like snow. So as people are coming up the street running from the scene of this new explosion, you can see them slipping on the ash and literally having to drag each other up the street. There's an incredible amount of panic down here in downtown Manhattan as people are realizing that they really need to leave the area entirely after spending the last hour or so just watching this from afar.
Rose, stay with us. Terrific work. Let me throw another couple of pieces of information out as we continue to put this all together into a straight line if we can. The United Nations has been evacuated. The Nations building on the east side of Manhattan has been evacuated. The city is in, this is election day, a primary election for mayor and city council races here in New York. That election has been postponed until further notice. Obviously, we are in the middle of an extraordinary catastrophe that started about 8:45 Eastern Time here in New York when one plane crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. About a half an hour after that, as people were converging, as fire and police and rescue teams were converging on the scene, a second plane appeared to the west of the Trade Center buildings and slammed into the second tower. That's what you just saw. Fire shooting out the north and east side of the tower. Shortly after that, we began to get reports of events taking place in Washington. An explosion which first came to us as a fire at the Pentagon. Now there's a report of a second hijacked plane heading towards the Pentagon. It is believed that one of the planes, perhaps both, but one of them we have been told was an American Airlines 767 that hit one of the Trade Center towers. About a half an hour after that, perhaps a little bit longer, lose track of time a little bit in these situations, the first tower, or let me correct that, the south tower, the second tower, the one to the left, collapsed. It collapsed in a cascade of smoke and spark, and what we cannot tell you is if there was a second explosion that caused that collapse or if it was simply, that's the first one, that's the south tower collapsing. And that was about a half hour, give or take, after the planes hit the tower. Then shortly after that, just as the smoke was starting to clear away, the second tower, and that's what you're looking at now. Again, this was not very long ago, 10-15 minutes ago. The second tower, it almost looks like one of those implosions of buildings that you see, except there is nothing controlled about this. This is devastation. How many people? There are 50,000 people who normally go to work in the Trade Center buildings. How many of those people had arrived already? How many of those people were trapped in the upper stories? How many of those people have been hurt? How many of those people died? We cannot tell you now. We can tell you that hospitals throughout the New York area are receiving literally hundreds of patients. And they are performing triage. They are trying to figure out who could be treated, who needs help first. This is sort of standard operating procedure. We are just being told now that Israel has evacuated all its diplomatic missions around the world. Israel has evacuated its missions. We are told now that Yasser Arafat has condemned these attacks, and we don't know yet who's behind them. Britain has condemned these attacks. Germany has convened its National Security Council, and we will check and see if events are going on in those places or if that is simply a reaction to what has gone on here in Washington and in New York. CNN's Gene Meserve joins us on the phone from Washington. Gene.
Hay Street, which is one of the major thoroughfares here in Washington, it is absolute gridlock. It takes about 15 minutes to drive one block. Ordinarily, this time of day, there'd be nothing near this kind of traffic. You see pedestrians filling the sidewalks, many of the businesses and offices here having closed. You see cars absolutely pouring out of the parking lots, contributing to the absolutely horrendous traffic situation. Many people trying to use their cell phones. However, cell phone service has become very difficult in this town because of the crush on circuits. For the most part, people appear to be very calm and collected. I will tell you, though, that as I drove, I looked at the car next to me full of some young women who I would guess were in their 20s, several of them crying their eyes out, obviously very upset as they listened to the radio and heard the news of what is happening in this city in New York also. Aaron, back to you.
Gene, thanks. Gene Meserve in Washington this morning as she and the rest of the organization continues to gather what facts we can, what facts are available in the wake of the extraordinary chaos that has followed this extraordinarily horrendous terrorist attack. American Airlines, we are told, one of the planes involved in this was a hijacked American Airlines 767 out of Logan Airport in Boston. American Airlines will say what is known as you look at the White House being evacuated a short time ago, or is that live? And I'm not sure on my monitor which it is. I believe it's taped from a short time ago. In any case, American Airlines will talk to reporters in about a half hour or so, 11:30 Eastern Time. One of its planes involved in this, and we will bring that press conference to you live when it happens. Here in New York, hospitals are being overwhelmed. As hundreds of patients are being brought in and being treated. We cannot tell you, we would not even begin to guess what the numbers in this will be, how many people will have died by the time this day is over, how many injuries have taken place in both Washington and New York. But as former police commissioner Howard Safir told us a few moments ago, obviously the numbers are going to be extraordinary. Who do we have on the phone, guys? Just help me out here. Patty, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
What do you got?
About an hour ago, I was on the corner of Broadway and Park Place. That's about 1,000 yards from the World Trade Center. When the first tower collapsed, it was a massive explosion. At the time, the police were trying desperately to evacuate people from the area. When that explosion occurred, it was like the scene out of a horror film. People started stampeding away from it.
Patty, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We told you there was a second plane that went down, this one around 80 miles or so southeast of Pittsburgh. We'll try now to connect with KDKA TV in Pittsburgh. Well, just so much for planning. We will try again. Again, we have...
We'll take it
reports
back
that
here
a
for a
plane-
moment in Los Angeles. It's Steve Edwards. As we are looking at the devastation in New York and in Washington and getting reports, a lot of questions being asked of what's going on here in Los Angeles, with much attention being focused out at LAX right now, and that's where Lisa Breckenridge is. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Steve. It's really quite a scene of sickening fear for so many of the people who have been trying to get to New York or any place in the country, only to be found to be told that all flights in and out of LAX have been stopped. No flights are being allowed in or out. Joining me right now is Rita. Rita, your last name?
My name is Moyo.
You were flying to New York.
Yes, I was.
Your state of mind right now?
I'm devastated. I can't imagine how this happened to this country. Things like this don't happen here. That's why we live here.
What is this saying to you?
This is saying that somebody better start figuring out who is planning all this and taking care of business. Getting the military and getting them out there and take care of these people that are destroying our country.
How have you been able to talk with friends or family back in New York? How's everything?
They're hysterical. They're actually hysterical. They said it's like a war zone. And very frightened because one of the planes was going to LA. They understood from LA. They thought I was on it. So they're very upset. Very upset.
Do you know, you don't even have any idea when you might be able to go home then?
No, I don't, but I don't think I'm going to fly. I really do think I'm going to take the bus. I don't want to fly.
Really?
It's just, I'm too afraid now. I mean, 3 planes. It doesn't happen here. I mean, this can't happen. We have to do something.
Rita, thank you so much. Steve, that's really been quite the feeling that we've been hearing today. As you can see, the people are starting to disperse from this area. This is where people are dropped off for their flights. And if you look over here, I'll show you, the police have kind of set up a little bit of a barricade because they're really trying to keep cars from parking along here. They're trying to keep traffic moving in and out very quickly. They're not letting anyone stop. People are having to be held downstairs on the departure or on the arriving flights for downstairs to be able to leave. So things here at LAX completely stopped as far as flights in and out. And that one flight, American Airlines flight, that we understand was hijacked, was from Boston heading here to LAX. And we've been trying to talk with people from American Airlines, and no one is speaking at this point. And we are still yet to hear from officials at LAX. We've just been hearing from the police that things have definitely been put to a standstill. Reporting live at LAX, I'm Lisa Breckenridge. Steve, back to you.
Lisa, you can't help but think as you stand there that that flight out of Boston would have been arriving here at LAX somewhere around now.
That's what we were thinking, around 9 o'clock. And so
what kind of notification did they put up on the board about that flight?
I don't know if we can get you inside to see. You want to go back this way? It's
Well,
just
that's
basically,
okay.
it's just basically
Yeah.
all it says is canceled, canceled, canceled.
Yeah.
And we're just seeing, all of a sudden we watched as the monitors all started turning red with the word canceled on it.
And what about flights in the air? How many more are expected in? I assume there's still flights that are going to be landing.
No one's been able to speak to us as to that. As you just see, that's a bomb detection K9 unit that just drove by. They definitely are on high alert here
Lisa,
at LAX.
I'm getting word that all international flights have been diverted to Canada. International flights have been diverted to Canada, so that's some of that answer. And there would be a lot of people coming in today for the Latin Grammy Awards.
Grammys, yeah, and you know, speaking locally, the Inglewood Police, they say that they have a tactical plan in place for tonight's Latin Grammy Awards at the Forum. Officers say the show will go on, so they obviously have some sort of a tactical plan that they're going to execute.
I'm just keeping my eye out to see if there's anyone else we can talk to for you. Like I said, right now, basically, we have mostly television crews up here. They've done a pretty good job of clearing things out here on the top deck of the American Airlines.
All right,
at
Lisa,
LAX.
thank you. We will get back to you a little bit later on.
American Airlines says they're going to
Yeah.
have a statement at 11:30 Eastern Time, so
8:30.
about half hour our time.
You know,
about the hijack plan.
there is a lot of confusion, as there will be. Everything is sketchy as you look at the shot of New York City, of Manhattan, in the direction of where the trade towers were. Those towers that dominated Manhattan, dominated the skyline.
lived in New York.
You know, they're gone.
The first time I ever walked into one of those buildings, though, I had a creepy feeling, very claustrophobic in those buildings.
And there is the result of all of it.
You know, some good news for the first time this morning coming over the wire, saying that many lives were saved because people were evacuated from the second trade tower immediately.
After the first
Many lives were saved.
All right, let's pick up some more coverage with the Fox News Channel right now.
Immediate concerns. I imagine that airspace over the United States right now is being monitored very carefully by
It
U.S.
is indeed.
armed
I
forces.
think you might describe, certainly all the Washington and New York areas are a no-fly zone, exactly that no aircraft of any kind is being permitted into them, and probably that will extend out into other parts of the country. And that's inevitable with this kind of a situation until you know more about it. You just can't take a chance on anyone. I think any plane that ventures into the airspace over Washington or New York will be shot down.
We should mention it is now 4 minutes past 11 in New York. That is East Coast time, 4 minutes past the hour. At 30 minutes past the hour, American Airlines will be broadcasting a special press conference in Dallas, out of Dallas, to describe the hijacking that we have heard about, which led to the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. Now, Secretary Weinberger, how long can we afford to be a nation in lockdown?
Well,
Let's switch our coverage right now from Fox to CNN.
Located the side that faces Arlington Cemetery. In front of me is a long line of rescue personnel with backboards. They're just waiting for victims to be brought out so they can rush them to nearby medical facilities. I see a few victims being treated on the grass outside the Pentagon. Firefighters continue to pour streams of water onto the side of the building, and a huge black cloud of smoke continues to billow out. It is a scene of utter destruction here. I'm sure it pales in comparison to the World Trade Center, but I've never seen anything like this myself in the history of the Pentagon. There's been nothing like this. Again, a huge gaping hole. You can see the exposed 5 floors of the Pentagon offices just ripped apart. Our report is that an aircraft of some kind, and at least one witness identified it as a civilian aircraft, hit the side of the building shortly after the incident in the World Trade Center this morning. People who were in their offices nearby reported hearing a huge explosion, seeing shards of shrapnel come by their window. The entire Pentagon has been evacuated. Short time after this attack, there were urgent announcements made over the loudspeaker telling people to quickly get away from the building because they had reports of a second plane heading this way just 2 minutes away. F-16 jets were scrambled over the Pentagon. I saw several of them go by, but no second plane ever materialized, and the building remains completely evacuated as firefighters continue to pour columns of water on the devastated side of the Pentagon, and rescue personnel continue to whisk victims away. We have no report at this time of how many casualties. Clearly, dozens and dozens of people have been hurt, and we presume that there have been some deaths as well. It's hard to imagine otherwise, considering extent damage at the side of the building. And I can see just some of the windows side, a stretch of the building, perhaps 40 or 50 feet wide. This looks like it has collapsed under the weight of the impact. Aaron?
Jamie, thank you. So we have planes hitting the Pentagon, or plane hitting the Pentagon, 2 planes hitting the World Trade Center's towers in New York. Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabga and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material. The ambulances have been coming now from as far as Long Island. All the rescue workers are being equipped with gas or face filter masks, and firefighters have been arriving even by pickup truck. Otherwise, the streets are now deserted.
Alan, thank you. Alan Dodd-Frank in Manhattan. A little more on this plane crash, which is the 4th incident, if you will. There was the plane crash at the Pentagon, crashing into the Pentagon. There were the 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center here in New York, and we don't know whether this 4th one is related or not, but the report is that a 747 en route from Chicago to New York City crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, about 80 miles to the southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's the incident. That's what we are hearing.
Started crying and bawling. And I'm standing next to a fireman. He said, yeah, they just bombed the Pentagon, too.
Our colleague, Jeff Greenfield. Well, we have a little more sound here from witnesses.
I work at the firewall company. The doorman goes to me, wow, I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom. It seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion. I don't know.
I was in B Tower. A Tower.
What floor were you on?
B1.
What floor?
First one.
What happened? Tell me.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere. Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement. Came down. All of a sudden, the elevator blew up. Smoke. I dragged the guy out. His skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
The words of some of the witnesses here in Manhattan this morning, and the pictures of what will, I suspect, before this is over, go down as one of the most horrific days in our lifetime. We're joined by our colleague, CNN's Jeff Greenfield.
You know, in 1993, when terrorists bombed the World Trade Center, their plan was to knock one of the towers into the other, bringing them both down. That disaster was averted, and bad as that was, in a sense, America was lucky. Another terrorist attack in the planning was interrupted to blow up the Lincoln Tunnel and submerge dozens, maybe hundreds of people. At the eve of the millennium, a suspected terrorist, was intercepted, you remember, at the Canadian border on his way to Seattle. And I know that not so long ago, former President Clinton, in a private...
All right, as we continue our hopscotching for coverage, we leave Aaron Brown and Jeff Greenfield, and we go back to Fox News Channel coverage right now of these unbelievable scenes in New York City.
And just can't believe it's all happening, and then the next thing we know, we turn around, the other one's going.
Peter Blanchard-Forty was explaining how the noise and the way it came across the city.
It seemed to have rumbled almost as if there was another large aircraft flying overhead, but really I think it was the collapse of the building, the volume of the explosion just coming across, just sound waves coming across the city.
The sound waves making their way up from lower Manhattan into the Flatiron District and up into Midtown, coming like a jet flying right overhead, I think is how you described it.
Yeah, just the rumblings of a jet sound almost, but it sounded more like a deep rumbling, probably from the explosion of the collapse.
It probably goes without saying at this point, as we pan back down to where the World Trade Center stood just a couple of hours ago, that communications in this city have become very difficult. There are people all over the world, no doubt, who knew people who were inside those two buildings. Some of the facts as they stack up, there are positives in all of this. In the first place, the first plane to crash allowed time for so many people, we would pray, to get out of those two buildings. And certainly before the collapse happened, there was time for a number of people to get away. If you are considering or trying at this moment to make a phone call into the New York City area or the Washington area, it's time for the good of the country to put the phone down and wait and rely on mass communications, because the people who are constructing what will be an enormous security situation now need as many lines as humanly possible. We don't have telephone lines on top. Our cell phones no longer get out. In the minutes after the first plane crashed, the phone began ringing in my house. It's the office, it's your mother, it's your father, it's your brother, it's your girlfriend. The phone lines immediately jammed throughout the city. There is a plea now for people around the world who may be watching not to use the telecommunication systems at this moment because the people who are mounting this rescue effort need it. It was described by Peter Blangiforti as others as a collapse around a pole which stood. Peter, you were describing what looked like maybe a big support column. You can keep the camera down there. You were describing, still seeing something before the smoke rose.
Before the smoke rose with the second tower, when it collapsed, you just saw almost as if one of the large girders or beams was going straight through the building and was the only thing left standing like a toothpick. And eventually that dropped too before the smoke engulfed everything else. But it was just a very strange, surreal sight.
Well, there are certainly reports from all over the city of what it was like in the minutes after the two towers were struck. Radio reports in the cab on the way here from reporters who were watching people literally jumping out of buildings. Certainly there was a massive fire and smoke on many different floors of the building. The size of the jet would lead us to believe certainly that a number of floors were wiped out almost immediately. And then the chaos to try and get out of that building. But certainly there will be stories of miracles as we go through all of this. And those people who were in that building and after the first explosion happened and the first crash happened, word of people who got out. I was listening on the radio, broadcasting live just about an hour ago to a woman who was in the second tower to be hit. She was able to walk down 92 floors in what she described to be a pretty controlled situation. 92 floors down the west tower of the building. She was able to walk without any chaos to give a radio report live. It's my understanding that literally thousands of people in the time before the two towers collapsed were able to make their way away from that area. Mass transit was certainly down at the time, but it's a quick walk to get out of that area. They had, a good 45 minutes, Ann Woolsey, to begin to make their way to the north. In Midtown right now, I was looking over this building and down into, in fact, I'm doing so right now. I'm looking down onto 47th Street, right below us. This to my right here, no, you don't have to, you can't see it from there, I don't believe. Maybe you can see Times Square over here. You can't. This is Times Square right below me. This is a scene right now at 11:15 in the morning, at 11:15 when this would be a sea of tourists on a spectacular day in Manhattan, and instead sirens echo across Manhattan, and that is the TKTS stand. I believe you're looking at that now. You're not able to see that, are you? The TKTS stand, can you see it on the lens? We can't. Pan back down to where the World Trade
numb
Center
shock all over this city and all across America. If you're watching us now, you're looking at the lower end of Manhattan where the World Trade Center once stood. It is gone this morning, obliterated after two strikes in coordinated attacks from airliners, one of them apparently hijacked from American Airlines. We are going to be getting a news conference from American Airlines in about 15 minutes. In the meantime, an Arabic newspaper, a fairly authoritative source, the editor of that London-based newspaper says Osama bin Laden, the Saudi-born, now exiled to Afghanistan rebel leader, Osama bin Laden, according to this newspaper editor, warned 3 weeks ago that he would attack American interests, and he promised a very big one. Now, we cannot yet attribute this to Osama bin Laden. However, that was the promise from this fairly authoritative London newspaper.
Well, John, certainly sources that I have talked to this morning, terrorist experts say this has the signature of Osama bin Laden, that he has the money, the network, the ability to carry out this type of coordinated attack. And let me point out that in the East African bombing terrorist trial here in New York City of the bombing of the two embassies in East Africa, that 3 of the alleged co-conspirators, one is now in jail, 2 are in jail, one's in jail, 2 cooperated for the United States government at the trial. They had pilot's licenses, and they can fly airplanes. So I'm sure investigators right now are trying to figure out a possible scenario. Were these planes hijacked by bin Laden people? Did they rush up to the cockpit? You don't need a gun. You can burst in, several of them, and strangle the pilots or something, and then take over the controls of an airplane near the last minute while you're flying and divert the plane and smash it right into
As we're listening to this, we're going to localize some of it. Los Angeles, the LAUSD, classes are being held. All field trips and other special things have been canceled today, but at this point, classes are being held. International flights that were heading toward LAX have been diverted to Canada. Domestic flights that are still in the air headed toward LAX are being diverted to Ontario International Airport. And obviously, after a while, there'll be none of them because all flights have been canceled. So after those planes that are in the air have either been diverted to Canada or Ontario, there will be a total shutdown. That happening here in Los Angeles. Also, the LA Police Department on tactical alert. No one is going home. Nobody is leaving after their shift is over, many of them being diverted to LAX, among other places, for protection. Dorothy?
Well, we're getting some preliminary reports that the two planes that crashed into the Twin Towers, both, a news station in New York, New York One, says both planes were hijacked out of Boston. One we know, Flight 11, American Airlines, from Boston to Los Angeles. It was a Boeing 767. American Airlines is saying now it can hold 158 passengers. We don't know how. That crashed was about the same size as the American Airlines jet that went down.
And I think if you heard me earlier, I told you the only way for us to escape it at the time was to break down the entrance to an apartment building just off the street. We had to break through the glass and get in through the second door to breathe. We were followed by a police officer as well who was struggling to breathe, and then a security guard who worked in the World Trade Center as well, and he had been trying to walk northward away from that mess behind us. Could you just clear back so that the camera can take a view down there? Thanks. And shoot down and you can see some of the activity while I'm reporting this to you. We also were able to interview a security guard who was working on the Concord and the plaza between the two World Trade Centers when the first explosion happened, when the first plane hit the first tower. He said he was dispatched down to the concourse to clear people away and to try to move people out of the World Trade Center. And then he said that's when the second explosion happened, which of course was the second tower. He said everything went pitch black. There was a cloud of smoke and a cloud of debris. When we happened upon him, it was extremely strange. He was all dressed in his black security uniform, but he was fully covered from head to toe in gray and wandering aimlessly. He said he was okay.
Hold on
we asked him
one
if he'd
second,
been
Ashley,
attended
if you
to.
can, because Pat Dawson, who is not far from you, is being asked to move.
All right, Tom, we've just been told we're being evacuated. You can see all the emergency workers walking north on the West Side Highway in New York. We've been told by firefighters here that there is a report of a bomb in this building. This is a school, a high school right here. And as you can see, they're moving everybody away from this building. They've said that there's a bomb in the building. They are evacuating us north now. That is according to firefighters on the scene. And we're going to move out of here right now just to keep ourselves safe. So we're going to start walking north ourselves. But that's what we're being told by New York City firefighters here, that there were reports of a bomb in that high school right there. It's called Stuyvesant High School. And so we are walking north to get out of the way. You can see just to my left here, these are even the ambulances which were down there are being moved north. The firefighters are being moved north. Everybody is being moved north. We're being asked by the police now to go north and get out of the way. Officer, do you have any idea of what the problem is?
There's a report of a secondary device possibly in the area of this school, so they're going to move everybody back as a precaution.
Secondary device meaning a bomb?
Possibly.
Okay, and where did that report come from? Was it called in?
It came in over our radios, and it's reported through our supervisors on down, so we're pulling everybody back.
And that's in the Stuyvesant High School right there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Officer McQuaid. That's Officer McQuaid of New York City Emergency Service. I'm sorry, what's it? Yeah, well, I don't think there was anyone in the school, Katie, this morning. At this point, I think everybody had been evacuated from here probably when the first events took place early this morning, just because of the fact that it's so close to the World Trade Center. Most of these buildings around here have been evacuated, so I would imagine, I never saw any kids going into that school this morning, so I'm going to presume that they never even allowed them to get to school this morning, and that anyone that were here at 8:45 were probably moved out almost within moments after the crash took place, because it literally is only about 10 blocks north of here, and I haven't seen any students coming in or out. Katie? Tom.
All right, that's Pat Dawson outside the Trade Center as they get moved back because of fears of another explosion. We want to catch you up to date now with the airplane situation. Airplanes apparently were used in these attacks today, commercial jetliners. And I want to remind you, you're watching NBC News coverage here on MSNBC. An FBI spokesman says the planes involved 2 American flights. American Flight 11, Boston to Los Angeles, involved in hitting one of the trade towers. Also, American 77 was involved apparently in one of the attacks, at least was hijacked. We don't know where that plane ended up. 2 United airplanes, United 175, that was scheduled Boston to Los Angeles. I just checked United's website. That plane supposedly left Boston at 8:14 this morning Eastern Time. Also United 93 from Newark to San Francisco. According to the United website, that plane left at 8:42. We do not know, except with American 11, exactly which plane ended up where. But according to this source from the FBI, those are the 4 commercial planes that have been involved in what is going on today. Now, we have been reporting another plane down some distance from Pittsburgh today. According to reports, and I want to stress this is coming from the affiliate there who got this in the scanner, so let's put this in perspective. But that plane believed to have originated in Chicago and was headed to Cleveland with 90 people on board. No word on the airline. And I'm just seeing, crossing the Associated Press wires now, American Airlines says it has lost 2 aircraft carrying a total of 156 people. Now, just crossing the Associated Press, American Airlines confirming 2 of its airplanes involved, a total of 156 people on board. Rick Sanchez is in Lower Manhattan. Rick?
Yeah, there have been, Lester, am I on? Is that you?
Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
Lester, there have been about four explosions here since about 11 o'clock. The most recent about 2 minutes ago that seemed to shake the ground that we're on. We're about a block and a half away from what used to be the World Trade Center. The area is completely surrounded in soot and ash. Firefighters and rescue officials are still really trying to get their act together. They're not quite sure how to approach this situation. They just did finally set up a command center. It's going to be set up at Chambers and West. They also have a triage center set up. That's at the local high school here, Stuyvesant High School, which is, as you know, not far from the World Trade Center. And there are still people in this area who are doing everything they possibly can.
Rick, I just want to stop you there. As the information's coming fast and furious, that's the same high school that we've just been reporting is apparently being evacuated for fears of a secondary device, another device. So even as you're reporting that, things are moving fast and furious. It's got to be incredibly difficult to figure out where safe ground is right now.
Well, we've been told, as a matter of fact, moments ago to try and get out of this area because they're moving everyone out. Their fear is, of course, that there are gas leaks, natural gas in this area that either fed into or out of the buildings that have exploded. And now those lines are open and may rupture. We're not positive and can't confirm exactly what has caused those 4 explosions we told you about at the beginning of our report. But there is reason to believe that they may be caused by some type of gas explosion or natural gas leaks in this area, and firefighters are extremely cautious as they try and work into the area. What they're doing now, Lester, is lining up on some of the adjacent streets and setting up, as what you know from covering stories like this, field forces, where they tell them, don't go out and freelance, don't go out on your own, stay in a group, we'll move into an area, and we'll somehow move in little by little. Meanwhile, firefighters and rescue officials, I just saw them come in as well, and they had what appeared to be pickaxes and other devices that they're going to be using perhaps to try and extricate people that might still be in there. The items that they had were handheld items that they were probably going to be using, we would assume, in some form to get into the area. However, at this point, we're only about a block away, and it does not appear that they're moving into the area.
Rick, I'm going to interrupt you here as we get new pictures in. These pictures from Washington, I believe it's tape or live. This is taped just a short time ago. This is the best look we've had at the damage at the Pentagon, where another plane apparently made a suicide plunge or was driven into a suicide plunge. There's the Capitol in the background. This just across the river in Virginia. The Pentagon struck sometime after 9 o'clock this morning as well. And again, this is tape of efforts to fight the fire there at the Pentagon. This following the 2 attacks earlier at the World Trade Center. Let's send it back over to Greg Jarrett now. Greg?
All right, thank you very much. Let me read from our hot file some new information coming in from 2 senior counterterrorism officials in the Clinton administration. They tell NBC News that the only organization with motivation and capability to execute a terrorist mission like this is Osama bin Laden. One official described this as the worst intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor, noting these attacks take months, if not years, to plan, and a large number of people. Joining us now on the telephone to talk about this, Lawrence Eagleburger, is former Secretary of State under the Reagan administration. Mr. Secretary, thank you. What is your reaction?
Well, you've said part of it already, which is that it clearly is an intelligence failure of some magnitude. Although, you know, the thing that I'm particularly surprised at is I thought the one thing we had under control was that people couldn't hijack aircraft in the U.S. anymore, but it's fairly clear now that that's also failed. I thought we had that one pretty well licked, but apparently we don't.
Osama bin Laden, how hard is he to find, to capture? How elusive is he?
He's very elusive. We've had a hard time tracking him. Having said that, since I happen to believe that this now is as much an act of war as anything, I think it now becomes much more incumbent upon us to go massively against him, not just try to find him, but any place where he may have been, and any government which may have housed him, as far as I'm concerned, now ought to be declared an enemy, and we ought to declare ourselves at war with all of them, and we ought to get massively engaged in cleaning it out, even if we are not necessarily hitting precisely the people that did this.
If the ruling Taliban in Afghanistan has been, if they have been housing these terrorist camps, and our intelligence indicates that, correct?
Yep.
Then what should we do?
We should take action against the Taliban government. We should take action against Afghanistan.
What kind of action?
Military action, and in massive quantities if necessary. Look, the basic point, it seems to me, and I don't think we ought to panic on this, and it sounds like I am and I'm not, but the basic point here is this is, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest equivalent to Pearl Harbor we've had in the last 60 years. And it's an act of war, and we ought to respond to it that way.
Lawrence Eagleburger, former Secretary of State, if you'd stand by for just a moment. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell for more from your vantage point. Andrea, where are you and what can you contribute?
The State Department has been evacuated, so I am here in the Washington Bureau, and Secretary Eagleburger is exactly right. The view within this administration, as within prior administrations, is that this is an act of war and that they do have plans. They have already, within the last 3 weeks, warned the Taliban government in Afghanistan that any act against the United States would be considered an act of war against the Taliban, against Afghanistan, or by the Taliban, I should say, and that retaliation would be done against Afghanistan. You will recall that after the embassy bombings in Tanzania and in Kenya, the U.S. did retaliate against Afghanistan and did retaliate against Sudan. That one, the latter, against Sudan, highly controversial because there were suggestions that they didn't have adequate evidence that Sudan was really implicated. But Secretary Eagleburger knows this as well as anyone, better than most. This is going to prompt military action by the United States. The immediate problem, of course, is how to respond to what could be an ongoing crisis, given the fact that we have other airplanes that may or may not have been hijacked and that buildings are still being secured, that we had an incident at the Pentagon today. The State Department has been evacuated. The NSC top officials are right now in the Situation Room conducting meetings. Other NSC officials are across the street in the old Executive Office building, but everyone else is out of the White House. At the CIA, George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence, is in meetings with his top officials, not in his normal operations center, not in his office, but in a special secure location. The State Department Operations Center has been moved out of its location to another location in Virginia.
Mr. Secretary, Lawrence Eagleburger, are you still with us? If you are, what happens? You've worked for a great many years in government. What happens in the Situation Room? What does the president do with his advisors?
Well, you know, assuming that this president acts like most presidents, he will gather them together and he'll ask for advice, and in the last analysis, he will make up his mind on what ought to be done. He'll have to hear from particularly his military advisors on what is available to react. You'll have to hear from Secretary Powell on how you deal with the other governments around the world to explain what it is we're doing, assuming we decide to do something. And by the way, I hope it is more than what we did when we responded to some of the last time. We need to, this is massive, the retaliation has to be massive, and I might say, I don't care very much about which terrorists they're going after. If they are clearly terrorists and they are antagonistic to the U.S., they ought to be considered, although it is also true that Osama bin Laden ought to be target number one. But anyway, the President will go through the discussion, and in the end, he will ask for suggestions on what ought to be done. They will put together a program and a plan, and he will bless it, and then they will go off and do it.
Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you a few more questions about Osama bin Laden, who increasingly, as the minutes and hours move on, is now probably the focus of our investigation into this very sophisticated and highly coordinated attack that took place beginning shortly before 9 o'clock this morning. We want to show our viewers who are just now joining us some of the videotape. The first tower had been struck, and there is the second plane, a terrorist attack, a hijacked American commercial jetliner crashing into the Second World Trade Center within an hour. Both towers collapsed to the ground. We heard NBC's Pat Dawson interviewing authorities. They anticipated that there were as many as 10,000 people inside each of these buildings when the day began. And as you see the collapse of the second building, it is unclear how many of them were still trapped inside, how many of them were able to get out. People on the ground as well died. To update also, beyond just Manhattan, the Pentagon, also the target of a terrorist attack, apparently according to eyewitness, a jetliner that had been, we presume, hijacked as well, crashing into the Pentagon. United Airlines now confirming a flight from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco crashed near Pittsburgh. In all, it is believed 4 hijacked planes, bringing so much horrific destruction. Also, we should tell you, planes across America have been grounded. Airports are closed. The nation's capital has been evacuated. The White House evacuated. And once again, you see the second crash of a hijacked jetliner into the World Trade Center towers that then came tumbling down.
There are a series of reports to give you from all across the United States, governments, state governments reacting everywhere to what has happened. We'll bring you a list in just a moment, but let's go to Lester. He has an update for us.
We're getting a little more information about the planes used in the attack of the World Trade Center. American Airlines is providing information now. It says two of its airplanes were hijacked, both used in the attacks on the Trade Center. One was Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. It was hijacked. That plane driven into one of the towers. The other plane was Flight 77. I don't have information yet on the kind of airplane involved there. American says those two planes carried a combined 156 people. Both of the attacks of the World Trade Center involved hijacked American Airlines planes. Keep in mind there were 2 United planes hijacked today. As you reported, the 757 from Newark to San Francisco is the one that apparently went down near Pittsburgh or in Pennsylvania. The other United flight, 175 from Boston to LAX, also hijacked. We have not confirmed the status of that airplane other than it was apparently hijacked, that according to the FBI. So we now know that both of the American planes were used in the New York attacks. United Airlines has apparently also lost 2 planes to hijackers as well. Greg, Chris?
Let me go back to former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, and let me read from Reuters, Mr. Secretary. Quote, "It is most likely the work of Islamic fundamentalists. Osama bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago that he would attack American interests in an unprecedented attack, a very big one." This, according to the editor of the London-based Arab newspaper. Mr. Secretary, given that the warning was well known, and certainly American intelligence must have known about it, and given the fact that we knew that Osama bin Laden favors the use of aircraft and has launched a couple of attacks, one of which was actually defeated before it took place through intelligence, how is it we could not have known about this?
Well, I think that's fairly understandable. You said, or somebody said, that this was highly sophisticated and very well planned, and I think that's true, including obviously the ability to keep the thing quiet, and obviously also It required a great deal of money, which leads you again back to Osama bin Laden. The one thing I don't understand, and it's critical to the rest of this, I guess, is, as I said, I thought we had licked the problem of hijacked aircraft in this country. It can only tell me that there was really sloppy procedures at these airports if, in fact, they were able to get on these aircraft and then hijack them. If we had been able to prevent that, a lot of this wouldn't have happened. What I have to say I don't understand is the ability to hijack these aircraft. I thought we had that under control. Once you've got these aircraft in your hands, it's awfully hard to see how, unless we had fighter aircraft over New York City, it's awfully hard to see how we could have prevented what happened. That isn't to say that there wasn't an intelligence failure. Clearly there was. Having said that, I'm prepared to say that I don't think that was unexpected as much as this ability to hijack these aircraft. That I simply do not understand.
Former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, many thanks. We appreciate it, sir.
My privilege.
Chris?
A police official now saying, on the condition of anonymity to the Associated Press, that the number of casualties from today's attacks on the World Trade Center could be in the thousands. You only had to look at the pictures to understand the enormity of the potential for loss of life. Estimated at least 10,000 people in each tower at the time of the attacks. Felipe Ayola was on the 81st floor when a plane struck the tower. He is on the phone with us now. Were you in the first or the second tower, sir?
I was in the second.
Tell us what you saw and heard and what happened.
I was actually on 81 and on 2 World Trade and then an explosion, and it was in 1 World Trade, and I saw the flames. I ran down to 78, which is the main concourse, where I met up with my wife and co-workers, and then I was asked to go back upstairs because it was safe and the problem was only in 1 World Trade. And then when I went upstairs, I left my wife there, told her it was okay. I went up to 81. I was looking out the window with a co-worker of mine as another explosion happened and the entire room just collapsed on me. And I was able to find stairs, and I can't find my wife, and I'm looking around now for her. So if she's listening, I just want to let her know that I'm okay, and I'm trying to find her.
I believe that I'm going to go through my notes right now, and we are being told that there is a place, sir, where you can call the Red Cross. They are trying to do some tracking. 877 Red Cross. You can call 877 Red Cross, and they may be able to give you some information. They are trying to keep track of people. We wish you the best. I do not want to keep Mr. Ayola on the phone when he does not know where his family is. You can call 877 Red Cross. Please let us know if your family is okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
We are now learning that there is another bomb threat, and Greg, while you go to that, let me tell you a number of things that are happening across the United States. Government buildings in Washington are closed. There are a number of evacuations all across the country, building closings across the country, from the Space Needle in Seattle being closed as a precaution. Government buildings all across the country are on a state of high alert and have been closed. Greg, what are you learning from the hot note?
Dateline Cleveland from Associated Press. Mayor Michael White now says a Boeing 767 out of Boston has made an emergency landing at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport because of concerns it may have a bomb. So, the threat continues. We are on
All 4 Disney parks have now been closed in the Orlando area. Presumably, there are evacuations there, but all 4 Disney parks in the area of Orlando, Florida, have been closed. In Los Angeles, police have gone on tactical alert. Governor Gray Davis has convened a meeting of the State Emergency Council. We understand that in Massachusetts, the acting governor, Jane Swift, has moved government operations to a bunker. Federal buildings in West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware have been closed. Maryland has closed all of its public schools. Now let's go over to Lester.
Chris, I'm looking at the airplanes involved here and have concluded, just based on the information, that in air traffic control centers, they must have known something was up. Let's take, for example, the American Flight 11. It's a 767 going from Boston to L.A. New York City is not one of the places it will cross over on that flight. That plane at some point left its flight path with no doubt several minutes warning before it entered the New York area. Now, whether the crew on board was instructed to declare an emergency, said we have a problem, we don't know, but that would give you a good indication that air traffic controllers knew something was amiss. Take a look at the other American flight, American 77. That was going from Washington Dulles to L.A. American says it was involved in the World Trade Center attack. Again, New York is not between Dulles and Los Angeles, so once again, this is a plane that controllers would have seen veer from its flight path. The United flight, the one we believe down in western Pennsylvania, that one that would have been on its flight path, but those two that involved the New York attack would suggest that warning bells were going off somewhere. They may not have known the intentions, but they knew something was going wrong with those airplanes with some lead time. Tell me, we're going to go to Jim Cummins now, who has been covering the American Airlines news conference. Jim?
That's right, Lester. We just a short time ago had a spokesman for American Airlines come out and say, and they are still gathering information. They're still not sure when they're going to have this briefing. But as you mentioned earlier, they had this release. I never thought I would be reading something like this. And it says American Airlines confirmed today that it lost 2 aircraft in tragic incidents this morning. They said the flights were Flight 11, as you said, a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles with 92 people on board. Flight 77, a Boeing 757 operating from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles with 64 people on board. That includes, of course, the flight crews. That comes out to a total of 156. And they said because of heightened security, due to the nature of today's events, American said it is working closely with U.S. government authorities. It says the government has shut down the entire air traffic system in the United States. American TWA and American Eagle will not operate. I stopped at DFW Airport on the way out here today. What they have done is they have sealed off the airport at every security checkpoint. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of pandemonium. Some people got sealed into the airport. Others couldn't get in. They came to meet flights. Flights were just being canceled one after the other while I was standing there looking at the monitors. And so the situation here at American Airlines headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas is this. Americans officials are meeting. They're huddled. They're trying to sort out what's going on. They told us they're going to have a statement sometime today, but we don't know yet when that will be. Lester?
And again, Jim, we want to put, here's the flights we know involved today that were hijacked. American Flight 11, Boston to Los Angeles, American Flight 77, both of those in the Trade Center attacks. United Flight 175, Boston to LAX. We don't know, we haven't confirmed the status of what happened to that airplane. And United 93, Newark to San Francisco, believed to be down in Pennsylvania. Jim, have American officials given us any indication on what communications preceded these crashes?
They have not. As you can imagine, there is a lot of concern here. Everywhere you walk, you see American employees looking just absolutely distressed. So the only information they have given us is just this one sheet of paper, which they handed out in a very low-key fashion, describing, in effect, 2 hijacked planes that were crashed today, killing, as I said, 156 people on those planes. They haven't said anything else about, if they had any early indications of this, but presumably, as you pointed out, these planes were definitely, diverted quickly, and so American would have found that out rather soon, I think, earlier this morning, and knew that something terrible was in the works.
All right, Jim Cummins, and if in fact controllers knew something was going on, the only thing they can really do is steer other planes out of the area. If they don't have contact with the plane, if it's left its flight path, all they can do is clear other airplanes out of the area as we watch once again one of those American planes plunging directly into the World Trade Center. Greg, Chris?
And of course, subsequently, both of the towers at the World Trade Center collapsed. Teresa Ward, who is on the phone with us now, was in the second building, the second tower, when the first one collapsed. Thank you for being with us at this difficult time. Tell us where you were, what you saw and heard. Can you hear us, Teresa Ward? We seem to...
Peter has me on hold for CNBC.
Hi, Teresa?
Yes, hi.
Hi, this is Chris Jansing at MSNBC. I understand that you were in the second building when the first one collapsed, is that right?
I was in the second building when the plane hit World Trade.
What can you tell us about what you saw and heard?
Well, I was at my desk, just, starting my day, and we felt a shudder. The entire building sort of shuddered. And at first we didn't really think, we sort of didn't know what happened, and we looked out the window and there was just debris and papers like a ticker tape parade falling from the sky. And immediately we just, everybody calmly walked down the stairs, and a lot of people who had already been part of the original bombing were there with us, and we all calmly started exiting the building. And then we heard an announcement that there was an incident in one World Trade Center, but 2 World Trade Center were just fine, so we could return to our offices. So we then took the elevator down, and clearly that was not correct. And as soon as I got out of the building, I could see that there was a second explosion because there was just burning debris coming down, showering on us, and we had to run for cover. And then they rushed us back into the concourse, and we were able to exit the other way. And by the time I got up to Houston Street, I turned around and you could see that 2 World Trade Center was just a cloud of smoke.
So you had been told to go back to your offices, but you made the decision to leave the building?
Yeah.
Obviously,
at that point, though, there was only an incident in 1 World Trade Center, and no one really knew what the incident was.
And you mentioned that you were with people who were there during the other attack, which you're talking about the 1993 bombing.
Right.
What was the conversation? What were people saying? What were they doing as you were getting out of the building?
We were just calmly walking down the stairs, thinking, what the heck happened? Somebody said a plane hit the building. Another person said a bomb. We really had no clue what was happening. So everybody was relatively calm, having been through the experience of the first one, and there wasn't any smoke in the stairwells this time or anything like that. So the move was very calm, and we were able to get out. But we got out right away as soon as we felt the shudder of the first explosion. So we were very, very fortunate.
You were, and thank you so much for calling us, and thanks so much. We're so glad that you are safe.
Make sure everyone and my friends and my family keep calling. I'm fine. Everybody's fine. Thank you very much.
Teresa expressing what certainly thousands of people are going through right now as they desperately try to reach family members who may have been in the World Trade Center or in that area this morning. The number of those certainly could number into the hundreds of thousands. And let me just tell you that the office of former President Gerald Ford has released a statement. Here it is. The United States must react strongly against this unconscionable terrorist attack. America should move aggressively to retaliate. Our governments must do everything possible to protect our citizens, echoing essentially the call of a former Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, who said this is an act of war and America must take decisive action.
You are watching NBC News coverage on MSNBC. 2 planes shortly before 9 o'clock East Coast time crashed into the World Trade Center, collapsing both towers. The loss of life is no doubt catastrophic. The Pentagon also hit apparently by a suicide bomber who hijacked a commercial jetliner. We're following all of these terrorist attacks, and the question is, how could it have happened? Bill Arkin joins us now on the telephone. He is a military analyst and a consultant to MSNBC and NBC News. Sir, thank you for taking the time. The Redmond Hart Commission report earlier this year itemized the many ways the U.S. is, they said, totally unguarded, a sitting duck for a terrorist attack. The report said the U.S. would be hit and hit very hard and very soon. Gerald Ford has suggested that we should strike aggressively. What should the U.S. do, and what will it do?
Well, it seems to me that there's sort of 2 things that Americans should think about today. I mean, one is our lack of preparedness. Even after the USS Cole was blown up in 1999 and the Khobar Towers incident in 1996 and the World Trade Center incident in 1993, our intelligence establishment has not solved the problem of doing any counterterrorism. As was said earlier on the air, these airplanes veered off of their courses, and yet no warnings could be delivered to the prospective targets of those hijackings. And our counterterrorism apparatus is really not able to respond. I mean, yes, we could lash out in the next day or a few days at the training camps of Osama bin Laden, as President Clinton did in Afghanistan. We could attack other terrorist organizations, but I'm not confident at this point that we really have a handle on understanding either who was responsible or where indeed they are to be found. There was just a story in the news this morning that was essentially saying that Palestinian organizations are having trouble coping with the number of suicide bomber volunteers that they're getting now to attack Israeli targets. This is not necessarily an easy problem to solve, but if I were an American today and I were thinking about this incident besides the enormous human tragedy involved, what I would certainly focus my attention on is how it is that we could possibly spend $30 billion a year on the U.S. intelligence establishment and have established hundreds of counterterrorism organizations in the last decade to deal with this very problem, and yet could be faced with such a massive tragedy at the same time.
One official said this was so sophisticated, so highly coordinated, it must have taken many months, if not a year or a year and a half, to plan. Where do we fail with our counterterrorism?
We failed because this morning at 8:59, before this incident occurred, at the Central Intelligence Agency in McLean and at the NSA headquarters in suburban Maryland, there were as many people working on the armed forces of Botswana as there were working on real-time counterterrorism issues. We have a constipated, blind intelligence establishment that we pay enormous amounts of money from our tax dollars every year, and they do not have their priorities focused on protecting American interests and American security. They're trying to do everything, and therefore they do nothing. And I think we are very passive in our response to counterterrorism as well. I mean, in this incident today, obviously, when two buildings like this are attacked, the disaster preparedness and medical establishment is going to have a very difficult time keeping up. This is not the scale of attack that any city, even New York City, prepares for. But having said that, we've focused so much attention in the past decade on responding to terrorist incidents. It seems to me that we have no idea of how we can avoid them in the first place, and we keep finding ourselves in this type of situation where I cannot say as an expert that I see any real changes in how we track terrorist organizations or how we deal with them or how we try to predict what they are doing in such a way that we're actually protecting American lives.
Bill Arkin, if you'll stand by for just a moment, we want to ask you a few more questions. Thank you.
Greg, you mentioned the Rudman Hart report. I'm holding it in my hand. It's a book. It's 146 pages long, and it says, as you indicated, that America is vulnerable to a catastrophic attack on the U.S. homeland. There have been 4 today, 2 in Lower Manhattan at the World Trade Center, another plane crash in Pittsburgh, and an attack as well on the Pentagon. Now, NBC's Joe Johns is standing by for us in Washington. We had heard quite a while ago about a report, Joe, that there was an attack on the Capitol as well. That is unfounded. Joe Johns, can you hear us? We apparently have lost contact with NBC's Joe Johns, but I am told that when he was on the phone just a short time ago, he was confirming that any reports of attacks on the U.S. Capitol are unfounded. Nevertheless, Washington is virtually shut down. Okay. Major buildings there have been evacuated. Let's go now to NBC's Joe Johns. Joe, what can you tell us?
Well, Chris, to my knowledge, no attack on the U.S. Capitol so far. There has been a great deal of concern, obviously. Right now, the city of Washington, D.C. as a whole is under lockdown. If you look at the Capitol just behind me, it was evacuated probably starting around 9:30 this morning Eastern Time. The Speaker of the House of Representatives was escorted out. Both the House and the Senate adjourned for the day. All of the employees in all of the buildings sent home. The police have evacuated the streets around the Capitol, and traffic is snarled, any traffic that can get close to the Capitol building. Now let me just give you a view. As you look across the horizon here, you can see the smoke rising from what I'm told is the Pentagon, where the apparent attack occurred earlier today. Senator John Warner of the state of Virginia, which is where the Pentagon is located, told reporters today that this today is another Pearl Harbor for the United States. Obviously a great deal of concern here among the members of Congress. We talked a little while earlier today to Congressman Porter Goss, who happens to be the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He said, of course, the United States has a number of contingencies available. While he was speaking, there were 2 loud booms. Not sure exactly what those were. Chris, back to you.
Now, we understand there were those military surveillance flights over Washington, D.C. Have you been able to see them, Joe?
We have seen, as a matter of fact, within just the last 3 or 4 minutes, a military plane which looked like it was scrambling either out of Bolling Air Force Base or out of Andrews Air Force Base, which is obviously the Air Force Base of choice in the Washington, D.C. area for military flights. That's about all we said. One thing that was of particular interest that really set off a huge stir at the Capitol between 9:30 and 9:45 Eastern Time, there was what appeared to be a very large plane, perhaps a 747. I saw it with my own eyes flying high above the Capitol, nonetheless directly above the Capitol, and then it veered off to a northwesterly direction. Highly unusual, because we have always presumed here in Washington, D.C. that for the most part, and certainly on a day like this, the area over the United States Capitol is in fact restricted airspace. A number of others saw that too. No clear word on what that plane was. From the distance I could see no markings on it. It took a sharp right turn and just flew away, and we have no idea what it was.
NBC's Joe Johns, thank you very much. Want to make this point. The enormity of what has happened across the United States is almost unfathomable. A police source in New York City saying that it is likely, it is possible that thousands of lives have been lost in this terrorist attack against the United States. In addition, the Federal Reserve reports it is ready to provide additional money to the U.S. banking system as needed following today's attacks. The economic fallout could very well be in the billions of dollars.
We have been watching all morning long what was caught on videotape, and there you see it. The collapse of one of the 2 twin towers of the World Trade Center. In the end, both came crashing to the ground. We did hear an official say 10,000 people are normally in each of those buildings. However, we've double-checked our statistical information, and we have 50,000 workers in the 2 towers. And in addition to that, they usually have about 150,000 visitors every day in that complex. Lester?
Yes, Chris says unfathomable to think how many people may have been affected by this. New York has one of the finest hospital and trauma network systems in the country. One of those places nearby, St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village. That's where NBC's Monica Devotny is reporting from now. Monica, describe the scene.
Lester, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a tough time hearing you. Let me just describe what I can see here. We're on West 12th. It's about 30 or 40 blocks, I would say, from the World Trade Center. Just to describe how far we are, my cameraman and soundman who arrived here before I did told me that when they got here, they were able to see a direct shot from our corner here of the 2 towers. They could see the towers flaming. Now there is nothing to see but billowing smoke. Absolutely nothing but smoke. As far as the hospital goes, lining the front of the hospital right now are dozens of hospital workers. They have been here for as long as I've been here, at least an hour, with stretchers lined up. They are waiting for victims to be brought in. There are also wheelchairs here, and the ambulances are coming in more and more frequently. When I first arrived about an hour ago, they were coming in every 10 to 15 minutes. Now, the frequency seems to be up about every 5 minutes. We have no number for sure on the number of victims brought to this hospital yet. I'm told there will be a briefing in a few minutes, so we'll get those numbers to you when we get them. As far as the ambulances go, we're seeing victims being pulled out in stretchers. Also seeing the NYPD coming in cars dropping off victims who are in better condition, who are actually able to walk. Everyone appears to be covered in soot.
The rescue workers are covered. One ambulance just pulled up about 5 minutes ago. It was filled with firefighters who were all covered in soot, and they were all placed into wheelchairs and wheeled up. We assume smoke inhalation there. One of the ambulances, when they opened it up to pull out the victims, water flooded out, so we can only assume that the scene there must be absolute chaos as they're trying to fight the fires and bring victims as quickly as possible. Let me see what else I can tell you. It's getting a little bit loud here. We're getting another round of NYPD. There are priests and rabbis here on the scene also walking around. We just saw a very moving moment where a priest was actually counseling a rescue worker. There will be countless stories, obviously, as this continues to unfold. Similar to what we saw in Oklahoma City, I'm sure, of the devastation that these rescue workers are seeing as they go in. Also, there's a white building just across the street here, and there's already a line of people because they're desperate for blood donations at this point. So New Yorkers lining up. There are hundreds of New Yorkers as this whole block is cordoned off, people watching, concerned, trying to get a look at the scene, trying to get a look at the victims. But many of them are choosing to line up now because they've been asked to give blood donations. That is the story from here right now. As I said, in a few minutes we're expected to get a briefing from hospital officials, so we hope to get some more numbers, some more accurate numbers on the actual number of victims that have been brought in at this point. Lester?
All right, Monica Novotny at St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village. We are getting word from the Associated Press, United Airlines now confirming a second airplane has crashed. Now, I think we have already reported that two of their planes were hijacked. One was going from Newark to San Francisco. That is the one that presumably went down in Pennsylvania. The other flight is a Boston to Los Angeles flight, a 767. The airline is now confirming that plane went down. They have not given the location. Keep in mind, a plane apparently hit the Pentagon. That plane has not previously been identified. But again, United and American both confirming they have lost two planes this morning. That Boston-Los Angeles one, we cannot say for certainty whether it is linked to this apparent coordinated series of terrorist attacks. But again, the airline now confirming it has lost a second airplane today. Airports across the country are shut down for commercial traffic. Keep in mind there are still a lot of other airplanes out there that don't traditionally fly at the higher altitudes under radar control. I'm told we've got something else crossing. What do we got? Okay, let's see. Something else coming. I don't see it, guys. What do you got? Okay, we're still... Okay, I'm gonna continue scanning the wires here. We're apparently getting some information, but Greg, let me send it back to you right now and figure out what's going on.
Let me just update you, if I can, Lester, because precautions are being taken all across the United States, and I just want to summarize a few of them because this is having an impact from coast to coast. The state of California is on high alert. The state's emergency council has convened there. In Colorado, city and state offices have stepped up security around government buildings. In Florida, security has been heightened at federal courts. Walt Disney World evacuated, closed all 4 of its parks in the Orlando area, as well as its shopping and entertainment complex. We had heard earlier that Governor Jeb Bush had convened an emergency meeting. In Georgia, all flights, obviously, at the airport are closed. The Sears Tower shut down in Chicago, Illinois. The National Guard there on a state of heightened alert throughout the state of Illinois. In Maryland, security officials tightening security all throughout the state. Security, not surprisingly, heightened at Andrews Air Force Base. Schools are closed there. In Nevada, security has been increased at casinos on the Las Vegas Strip, at federal buildings across the state, at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas. All the airports and the river crossings into New York City from New Jersey have been closed. In North Carolina, military bases are preparing for a possible change in status. In Pennsylvania, National Park Service officials meeting to determine whether the city's high-profile tourist attractions, which include the Liberty Bell Independence Hall, will be closed. There are many more across the country, but let's go now back to Lower Manhattan. Rick Sanchez has been there throughout this morning for us. Rick, tell us where you are and what the latest is.
Well, I'm in that area, if you're familiar with this area of where West Broadway and Hudson
come together right at Chambers. That would put us about a block and a half away from the site of where the explosion was. That area has just been evacuated because police have found what they describe as a suspicious device, and they fear that it might be something that could lead to another explosion. Obviously, there's a real sense of caution here on the part of police. I spoke with some police officials moments ago, Chris, and they told me that they have reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center, aside from the ones that may have been caused by the impact of the plane with the building, may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it. So their fear is that there may have been explosive device planted either in the building or in the adjacent area, and that's why they're being so cautious in this vicinity right now. As far as the area is concerned, we're completely engulfed in soot and in ash, and where the building once stood, looking at it from where we are right now, from ground level, you still can't see through the soot. It's still so dark, it would be like a thunderstorm cloud in the middle of a summer rainfall, but right standing in the middle of New York City, so you can't actually see through it. It's quite something to see.
But in terms of officials, in terms of police, in terms of rescue, in terms of firefighters, what can you tell us?
This is what they're trying to do. They're trying to set up several field forces to go into command centers. Some of them have been set up, but it's really still preliminary. This is why it's so difficult for them in this area where we are. Imagine they came here originally to deal with the crisis. They set up some command centers, and they had many of their chiefs and many of their supervisors in the area of the building. The second and third explosions literally have wreaked havoc on those field forces and those command centers, so they've had to back up, and now they're trying to see how they can approach it again. They are enlisting the support of doctors in this area. One, a medical conference that happened to be down the street in Manhattan. Surgeons from all over the country that happen to be here in New York City. They've gone to the hotel, put them on a bus, and they've just brought them into this area, and they're going to be assisting in this triage unit that they're hoping to set up. We're still not sure that they've actually been able to set it up, but to be perfectly honest with you, Chris, it appears to us, looking at it here firsthand, that officers and rescue officials are really having an uphill time trying to figure out exactly how they're going to attack this problem. I did see some fire rescue officials going in with picks and axes, so it did appear that they're at least moving into the area, but with a lot of caution.
Rick Sanchez, thank you very much. A tragedy of unprecedented proportions in Lower Manhattan, one of at least 4 places where there have been apparent terrorist attacks against the United States. As we continue our coverage here, Joe Cantamesa is sitting with me. Investigator. Let's separate this out. You have an immediate problem, Joe, obviously, that we just heard Rick explain, which is in these various locations, Washington, Pennsylvania, New York City, there's a disaster on hand that needs to be dealt with. But I read a list in states across the country. They're going on alert. How do individual governments, how does the federal government even begin to deal with the possibility of an ongoing terrorist threat?
Well, wherever possible, they should be maintaining any type of proactive preparation to protect or minimize any damage should there be an attack somewhere else. Right now, the chaos and confusion that is certainly in Manhattan and at the Pentagon and other locations are really being hampered by the unsafe conditions. We can see what happened by just the timing of the tower collapses after the initial strikes. So confusion has got to be rampant. WPXI is our local affiliate in Pennsylvania. Let's listen into their coverage. Again, that is where a plane crash happened at Somerset County Airport.
From downtown. It's really nothing like we've ever seen before here. I think that's safe to say. And again, just a quick update on the plane crash here in our area. It was United 757. We don't know how many people are on board. We have to assume the worst given the pictures we've seen there and the accounts of the scene of a crater in the ground and very, very little in the way of debris. Rick Earl just telling us that the largest piece they found is about 5 feet long. There is again shots of New York as the unbelievably.
That's the second tower, the first tower that was hit first collapsing, but the second one to collapse.
And the Pittsburgh incident that they were describing, United Airlines Flight 93, a 757 from Newark to Washington National to San Francisco International in California. That was the itinerary. Other planes includes American Airlines Flight 11, Boston to LAX with 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. American Flight 77, a 757 from Dulles to LAX, Los Angeles, 58 passengers, 4 flight attendants, 2 pilots. And United Airlines Flight 175, a 767 from Boston to Los Angeles. We don't know the number of passengers and crew members at this point, but it all began this morning a little before 9 a.m. Eastern Time when the first of 2 towers of the World Trade Center were attacked by terrorists, a hijacked plane that flew directly into the World Trade Center.
Joining us now on the telephone, Rick Hahn, who was involved in the investigation into the World Trade Center bombing back in '93 and the Oklahoma City bombing as well. Mr. Hahn, your reaction?
This coordinated attack is the most grotesque terrorist event that the world has ever seen. And at this point in time, it is not untypical. You'll have a lot of different claims of credit from different organizations. For example, at World Trade Center in '93, there were actually 5 different groups that claimed credit initially. We don't know at this point in time who may be responsible for this, but woe be to them. I think that America will not rest until those culpable for this have been brought to justice.
Mr. Hahn, you are probably familiar with the Rudman Hart Commission, reported earlier this year, itemizing in great detail. In fact, I'm holding it here in my hand. In many ways, the U.S. is unguarded, a sitting duck for this kind of terrorist attack. The report said the U.S. is going to be hit hard and hit very soon, and it happened today, September 11, 2001. Let's go to Chris Brown, who is our NBC Pentagon correspondent, or producer, excuse me. Rick, go ahead.
I am in a makeshift public information office about a mile or so away from the Pentagon. It's where the Navy has kind of set up some temporary operations right now.
And describe the scene.
Well, it's just an office right now. People are just trying to find out where each other is. Obviously, cell phones are not working very well. We're actually set up inside the offices of the Virginia Department of Transportation office here, and people are really right now just trying to find out where everyone is and try to coordinate what's going on.
Chris, what's the U.S. response to all of this?
Well, right now, we have been told by U.S. officials that 2 Navy carrier battle groups, the USS George Washington and the USS John F. Kennedy, are being dispatched out of Norfolk Naval Base right now. They are getting underway and heading up the eastern seaboard. Presumably, one will be sent up as far up the Chesapeake Bay as possible to cover the Washington, D.C. area, and the other will be heading towards New York City. That is not definite right now in terms of which is going where, or both may be heading towards New York. That is uncertain right now, but we do know that 2 carrier battle groups are getting underway from Norfolk and heading up the eastern seaboard as we speak.
Chris Brown, the producer over there at the Pentagon, thanks very much for that update. Rick Hahn, I trust you were listening to that. What do you anticipate would be the next move? Rick, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
All right. Rick, I held up the Rudman Hart Commission that said we were going to get attacked like this. We were a sitting duck for a terrorist attack. It would hit hard and it would hit soon. Where did we fail?
I don't think that we necessarily did fail. This is a very free nation. There's no nation in the world where you can travel about and do the things that you do in the United States.
Why didn't our counterterrorism unit, and especially the CIA, know of this ahead of time? This is a very sophisticated, well-coordinated attack that must have taken months, according to a senior State Department official, if not years.
The intelligence community regularly gets all types of information regarding potential threats. There is, however, a chasm between freedom of speech speech where people talk about doing things and the actual acts themselves. And it's frequently impossible to discern whether someone is merely talking or, in fact, is planning to do some sort of terrorist event. I suspect that if we had any sort of information at all regarding this in advance, that it was still being evaluated.
We did, and let me turn to Joe Cantamesa. Rick, if you'll hang on for just a moment. It was reported 3 weeks ago by the editor of an Arab newspaper that Osama bin Laden planned this kind of an attack very soon. He said it would be an unprecedented attack.
Clearly that statement has been made, and the intelligence community was doing what it normally does in trying to collect and analyze information that's readily available. We have a real serious issue, however, with Osama bin Laden and his group in particular, that they use sophisticated communications, satellite communications, they move around a lot, they use encryption, and they use a great deal of anonymity where a lot of the information that certainly went into this particular planning session clearly was either missed or not adhered to.
A couple of updates. The Kennedy Space Center has been closed. The shuttles are in their hangars. The Kennedy Space Center has been closed. First Lady Laura Bush, when these attacks first occurred, was about to make her policy debut before a Senate committee. After the announcement of what had happened by Senator Edward Kennedy, who is chairman of the commission, she said, "Our hearts and prayers go out to the victims of this act of terrorism." She was whisked by motorcade to an unidentified secure location away from the White House, which of course has also been threatened by attack. The White House has been evacuated. We are told she was able to use a secure phone to talk with her husband, the president, who was on his way back from an appearance in Florida. She has also spoken to her two daughters to make sure that they are okay. Her twin daughters are at college, and she has been able to assure that they were all right. Vice President Dick Cheney was at the White House at the time the attacks began. He also has been moved to a separate secure location. That's the latest we're getting off the hot file, Greg.
Let me read Dateline, West Bank. Thousands of Palestinians celebrated today's terror attacks in the United States, chanting, "God is great," and distributing candy to passers-by, even as their leader, Yasser Arafat, said he was horrified at the attacks. The attacks, of course, and we've been showing you the videotape, two planes crashing into the World Trade Center. There is the second plane. Both towers, within an hour, then collapsed. There are as many as 150,000 people that visit the Twin Towers each day, and our estimate is 50,000 total workers. We have no idea how many people had been trapped inside, how many were able to be evacuated.
And in fact, the official listing for the New York City Emergency Response Center is in the World Trade Center on the 23rd floor. We have been hearing from our reporters, our correspondents in the field, that field forces are being set up in various command centers, but the situation around the World Trade Center is extremely dangerous. It is somewhat chaotic. There have been a steady stream since before 9 o'clock this morning of emergency vehicles moving into the area, and there were countless emergency personnel in that area when first one of the World Trade Towers collapsed and then the second.
And the Pentagon took a direct, devastating hit also from an aircraft, and the enduring symbols of American power evacuated today as this apparent terrorist attack quickly spread fear and chaos in the nation's capital. The White House evacuated except for top personnel in the Situation Room. The Capitol has been evacuated, the Capitol building, it's safe. The nation's leaders taken to a secure location. We're going to pause here. We're not going to speak as we watch this horrible collapse of the World Trade Center. Let's listen and watch. The fate of those inside the twin skyscrapers, some 110 stories high, not immediately known. Authorities have been trying to evacuate the 50,000 people who worked there, but many were thought to be trapped inside, and there is the second collapse to the ground. And there were firefighters who were on the scene, in the building. They were around the building as it collapsed. Paramedics were there, ambulance workers. Our own reporters on the scene described an ambulance that literally blew up. And the loss of life here is just catastrophic.
And we also heard from Rick Sanchez, who was on the scene. He was with a group of firefighters who had their radios on, and there were people caught in the wreckage of the Twin Towers who were calling for help. There is a massive emergency situation going on, as you would expect, and you can see these pictures from just a little bit earlier from the World Trade Center. Ken Allard, MSNBC military analyst, is on the phone. Can you hear me, Ken?
Yeah, sure can, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, and let me get your reaction to this. Lawrence Eagleburger, the former Secretary of State, was with us a short time ago. He called this an act of war. Gerald Ford called for quick action. Let me get your response.
Well, Chris, I think that's absolutely right. Driving over here to the studio this morning, I could see the smoke from the Pentagon, a building where I worked for 5 years, and that was the only thought that occurred to me. This is the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. And I don't see any conceivable response to this except to get out of this paradigm that we've had, that this is some problem with the justice system, that this is something that we have to pursue criminal indictments and extradite people. This was an act of war. Osama bin Laden and his group declared that 2 years ago when they attacked our embassies in Africa. And it shows what happens when you don't take the war to him. He takes the war to you, and that's what happened here this morning.
And apparently he issued a warning as recently as just a few weeks ago, Ken. How well prepared are we if we're going to mount a swift and sure response?
Well, Chris, that's going to be the problem. I mean, sitting here right now, I'm having a great deal of difficulty keeping my own emotions in check as a former soldier, because you see something like this and you have a visceral response. What we're going to have to do is to make sure that what we do is something which we can defend to the rest of the world, because one of the critical points here is that we now have the opportunity to put together a world alliance against this kind of terrorism, and that's the only way in the ultimate, in the last analysis, that we're ever going to be able to defeat it.
And it took something this major, the previous terrorist attacks dating back to the first 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, and Osama bin Laden is still at large, Ken.
Well, he is not only still at large. I would agree with most of what Bill Arkin had to say about the fact that our intelligence community has not been able to get after him. We always seem to be responding to what he does, okay? You know, that's not the way you win the war against terrorism, okay? You don't have to respond to what he does. You have to make him respond to what you're doing to him. We have never been able to get that edge against him. And I think what's going to have to happen here is a total change in the way that we, number one, understand what's happened, and number two, how we prosecute a war. And I use that term advisedly. This is a war against terrorism. We ought to declare it, and we ought to fight it.
Ken, this is Greg Jarrett. There have been two other foiled attempts in which Osama bin Laden's terrorist network had planned for years to use aircraft in terrorist attacks. There was the so-called Day of Hate over the Pacific, January of 1995. The plan there was to plant bombs in 11 U.S. airliners, all timed to go off during a 48-hour period as they flew over the open Pacific. Fortunately, that plot was foiled, uncovered, when a Manila bomb factory caught fire. Then there was the other planned attack, well known, on the CIA. The plan there was to fly a small aircraft into CIA headquarters. Bin Laden, of course, trained his associates as pilots. The plan was never carried out because an associate was arrested in Manila back in 1995. But given that track record, given the warning we had 3 weeks ago, surely there was something that could have been done to better anticipate this sort of thing.
Well, Greg, I'll go right back to what we've been talking about in terms of the metaphor to Pearl Harbor. I'm constantly struck at how appropriate that is, and I would suspect that when we actually uncover everything that went into the intelligence picture this morning, we will find that, yes, indeed, we should have known. But that's 20/20 hindsight. Greg, you've also been talking about, and I think it's appropriate that we do so, the Graham-Rudman report that was put together by two former United States senators. I've read that. They are absolutely correct when they talk about the fact that the United States has been a sitting duck for a long period of time, not only in our airports but also in our borders. Security has been a joke for a very long period of time. And you leave that open for that long a period of time, and someone's going to take advantage of it. So everything that you've been talking about in terms of foiling a plot against Osama bin Laden, that's fine. You want to try and do that. The only way you win this war, very frankly, is the way that the Israelis have been taking out the Palestinian leadership. And they've been very aggressive in going at that leadership to address that problem right at the source. And we haven't done that.
Our military analyst, Ken Allard. Stand by, Ken, if you would. Your insight's appreciated. Over to Lester Holt. Lester?
All right, Greg, we are getting an idea of what air traffic controllers may have seen this morning. The first indication something was happening. We are going to show you with Flight Explorer. That's American Flight 11, Boston to L.A., going up upstate New York, and suddenly makes a sharp turn, 180-degree heading right toward New York City. That's probably at least a 30-minute flight there. The controllers know this plane is not only slightly off course, way off course. This again from Flight Explorer. As that plane was being tracked, there it makes that sharp turn way off course on a beeline to New York City, where it slammed into one of the World Trade Center towers today. That plane was scheduled to leave about 7:45 from Boston this morning. It's not clear if that's the one you're seeing there. Remember, two airplanes hit separate towers, and we're not clear of the order yet. But this is something I pointed out earlier, that there was indications a good time before these attacks that something horrible was happening. What would an air controller do in a case like this? Not a lot. You could be making radio call after radio call to the plane. When you decide he's not listening or ignoring, all you can do is get on the horn to other planes, clear out of the way. We don't know where this guy's going. Clearly he was dropping in altitude as well as he's making this approach. This was a plane that would have then come straight into the Newark International Airspace, LaGuardia, JFK, all in that area. So clearly other planes had to have been aware that there was a rogue airplane in the sky. American Airlines only given us a brief statement saying it lost two airplanes. We don't know the nature of any conversations that took place between the crew, between the air traffic controllers. They also have their own private data links between the cockpit and the airline headquarters when they have a mechanical problem. An airplane can squawk, what's called squawk, a certain code on its transponder. That lights up at the air traffic control center. It's a code that says I'm being hijacked. There's no voice communications, but if the pilot can somehow surreptitiously punch in that code, it would alert someone to at least know this plane is in trouble. On the phone with us now is, give me the name again, Kathleen Zicci with the NYU Medical Center. Kathleen, can you tell us about the casualties you've received there?
Yes, I'm with NYU Downtown Hospital in Lower Manhattan, and the last count that I have, we have several hundred casualties here. Several hundred patients here who are waiting to be, who are being treated. We have at this point 3 fatalities. We had one very severe burn case that was transferred to the burn center, but the entire medical staff has been mobilized, as has the nursing staff, and they are proceeding in a very orderly fashion to treat the patients as they arrive.
Kathleen, I know hospitals such as yours practice disaster drills.
That's absolutely
correct. Have you ever
correct.
practiced for anything on the scale of several hundred casualties in your emergency room?
Yes, it has. In fact, it has been practiced as recently as 2 weeks ago. We had a full-scale disaster drill at the hospital.
So tell me what happens now. People are coming by foot, ambulances. How are they getting there?
They are coming by every mode of transportation. Then they have been arriving in police cars, ambulances, taxi cabs.
What happens when they arrive? Who makes the decision where they go?
There is a nurse on duty who assesses the degree of the injury and makes a determination about the severity of the injury, and then assigns the patient to a specific area based on the degree of injury.
Can you tell us, is it pandemonium? Is it chaos? Have you managed to find some order in all of this?
There are a great many people here, and there is a very high level of activity. We saw in '93 when we were the primary responder to the World Trade Center explosion at that time, that this kind of situation brings out the absolute finest behavior of our employees and our staff. Everybody from the housekeeping people to the dietary workers have been working as hard as they can to respond to the needs of the patients who are coming through the doors.
Kathleen, do you have a big picture view as to how many hospitals are accepting immediate casualties and who's going where?
Actually, I don't have that information because we're so focused on what is coming through our door at this moment, and that part of the bigger picture, I don't have detailed information about that.
Are there other physicians, nurses, paramedics from outside your hospital who have come there to work?
There have been a number of people who have arrived and have volunteered their services, ranging from nursing students to people in the neighborhood who wanted to do anything they could to help the individuals who were injured.
Kathleen, as we all watched and shuddered as these buildings came crashing down, my first thoughts were there's so many rescue workers, firefighters, police who are right there on the scene. Have you received a lot of emergency services personnel?
I have seen a number myself in the cafeteria, which is like wall-to-wall patients at this point. And I have seen that a number of them were emergency services personnel. I can't give you any precise breakdown on numbers, but I know that we have people here who have been responding to the disaster.
I have attempted to make my own phone calls into roughly your neighborhood. I know communications is tough.
Yeah, it's very hard from a phone standpoint.
How are you notifying loved ones, patients' families, or are you just simply not able to?
Well, we're getting some calls and some inquiries, and the people who've called, we've asked to be patient with us and to give us callback numbers because there are hundreds of people here, so it does take a bit of time. Excuse me. We're trying our best to respond to the needs of people who are obviously worried and concerned about people that they love. Our first obligation is to keep people alive, and we're doing the best we can to balance both of those considerations.
Kathleen, those of us who are working this from all angles, be it in the anchor chair or in a hospital, we're very caught up in the moment, but has the enormity of what has taken place, has it begun to sink in on you and those who are doing the job you're doing?
Absolutely not. We're too busy here. We're just trying our best to handle to the absolute best of our ability and with every bit of excellence we can muster what the patients need.
Kathleen,
we cannot think of the bigger picture at this point.
And we are going to let you get back to tending to the patients. Kathleen, thanks for taking the time and filling us in. Several hundred casualties at that downtown hospital. While we were talking, this note just crossed over the wires. A Navy public affairs spokesperson telling a Washington network affiliate television station that there are dead inside the Pentagon. One of these hijacked planes came crashing down. What appears to be a glancing blow on the Pentagon. In fact, NBC's Jay Barbary spoke to a friend who works in the Pentagon who believed that the pilot appeared to make a deliberate nosedive into the pad area, the helipad area, in a way to avoid the heart of the Pentagon, and perhaps it could have been a heroic act by the pilot. From this friend of Jay Barbary's vantage point, the damage done to the Pentagon came really from the plane's debris, so not a direct hit, perhaps a last-minute effort by a pilot under incredible duress to save as many lives as possible. This is continuing NBC News coverage on MSNBC. Brian Williams now anchors our coverage. Brian?
Lester, thank you. As one government official put it this morning, the United States is in a state of war. We just don't know yet against whom. This is certainly the worst and most coordinated single attack in the history of the United States. There are comparisons today to the feeling around the country the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Certainly the largest, most catastrophic collapse of the intelligence system in this country. The day began when people in the metropolitan New York area thought there had been a horrific accident. An aircraft had crashed into one of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. Then came this. As people were watching the after effects of the first crash, a second plane, and we later learned a hijacked commercial airliner, crashed into the other tower. It was later in the morning, some say as a result of secondary and subsequent explosions, that both towers came down. The skyline of the city of New York today is now permanently changed, and as was the case over 30 years ago, the Empire State Building is now once again the tallest structure as you look at the eerie sight that is the skyline of New York. As people are pausing to do across this area, this is a live picture. This is what it looks like for the millions of people in the New York metropolitan area, any of them who have a vantage point to look over to the city from suburban Long Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, the surrounding areas. The airspace over New York, and for that matter over the continental United States, has been cleaned, sanitized, to use the parlance of the FAA, for some hours now, when it was learned there were 4 hijackings this morning. Again, this is a tightly coordinated attack on the United States by forces as yet unknown to us. President Bush learned of this when he was at a school event in Florida this morning, and he told a stunned audience that there had been a national emergency, a coordinated attack, that 2 aircraft had crashed into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The president, and it was reminiscent of Lyndon Johnson being hustled onto Air Force One in Dallas, Texas, was hustled on to the aircraft and left for we knew not where. We have now been told, and the control room is helping me out here, that the president will make a statement shortly that Air Force One has indeed been aloft, but for a short flight. He is at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Now, the thinking here is that it was the closest and most heavily fortified military facility. Air Force One does have the ability to refuel in midair. It has never been tested with a president on board, but it does have the capacity. But apparently they have put down, since the White House has been evacuated except for the Situation Room, since a plane crashed at the Pentagon, and since most of official Washington and most of New York has been locked down and evacuated from buildings, it has been deemed that the president is safest at a U.S. military facility. Believe it or not, in present-day America, here we are in the year 2001, and this is the situation. It's 12:40 now here in the East, and we've just been told that the president will speak shortly from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Now, we presume the television networks, we should tell you, have agreed to pool resources today as best we all can, so that what is seen on one network will be seen on all. This is not today a competitive business. Today is the business of covering a national tragedy and a national emergency, and the president will have much to say about this when we hear from him. Colin Powell has issued a statement, the Secretary of State. Remember, as I mentioned, he of course works out of the State Department, where there was a car bomb this morning, and I'm looking for his statement. Here it is. Colin Powell, Dateline, Lima, Peru, Reuters news agency. Secretary of State Colin Powell vowing that terrorism would not crush America or democracy. Cut short his first South American tour Tuesday after massive aircraft attacks in New York and Washington. Quote, "A terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation. Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose," a somber Powell told a meeting of the Organization of American States in Lima, Peru just now. 22 international flights are currently in the air, are inbound, and frankly with nowhere else to go, are going to be given clearance to land in the U.S. This is the only allowance that has been granted so far this morning since the airspace over this country was, quote, sanitized, close quote. They were originally diverted to Canada, but the latest update is 22 inbound flights from overseas locales will be allowed to land in this country. We have with us a man who sadly has joined us all too often over the past decade or so when the news we cover involves air tragedies. David Stempler is president of the Air Travelers Association. David, I'm curious, you've been watching the coverage, listening to it along with all of us. Your reaction?
Shocking. It's just hard to believe. It's hard to fathom the extent of this tragedy and this attack on the United States. It's just beyond our comprehension. And it's not the kind of thing, Brian, that we really expected as a threat. I don't think in any of the security meetings I ever attended did anyone discuss the domestic hijacking threat as one where hijackers would take over airplanes and then attack buildings or attack facilities.
David, I want to go to a graphic that our viewers just saw on our air, and let's try to coordinate this while you talk. You can explain what we're seeing. This is from the website Flight Tracker, which every commercial aircraft, every jet aircraft has a transponder, which is then traced by Global Positioning System. This is the American Airlines flight out of Boston. And David, what are we watching here?
Right. This is something I sent over to you. Flight Explorer, which developed this out in Virginia, sent this over to me. They reconstructed this. This is the flight track of American Airlines flight number 11 as it came out of Boston and was heading on its route to Los Angeles. You'll see 4 lines there. The top line is the airline number, American Airlines flight number 11. The next line, the left number, is the altitude at which the aircraft is at. The right number in that second line is the airspeed. The third line shows the originating point, Boston, and its scheduled destination point, Los Angeles. The last line shows the aircraft type, in this case a Boeing 767-200, and the proposed arrival time in Los Angeles in Eastern Time, at that point 1:49. As we track the airplane out of Boston, it seems to be making a normal departure out of the Boston area. I know your screen shows beyond this at this point. When it gets back to Boston, let's start again. It's coming out of Boston, turns west, going through western Massachusetts, going into upstate New York above Albany, and it makes a very hard left turn there. Now, the folks at Flight Tracker have indicated to me that that plane made that turn at 8:28 a.m., according to the data that they received from the FAA. The flight coordinates, Brian, were 42.8 north, 74.15 west. Now, what's also quite interesting in this tracking is you'll see that when the airplane did come out of Boston and start heading out west, it was climbing through 29,000 feet, apparently on its way to a higher altitude.
On that classic northern route, by the way, David, that would have taken it across the continent.
Right, and up over Chicago, perhaps,
right,
and down into Los Angeles. Great circle route, Brian.
Right.
What we start to notice, and I've had a chance to be able to look at this for some time, Brian, it was at a steady cruising speed of about 457 knots. Just before, or apparently around the time of the hijacking, the speed gets very erratic. It goes to 427 knots, drops about 100 knots down to 340 knots. Maybe that's when they were getting control of the airplane. Back up to 470 knots, up to 495 knots, up over 500 knots, 493, 441, 407, 396, 390 knots, and then finally on the last readout, 313 knots. This is quite a dramatic picture, and you know, Brian, that we would have not seen any kind of tracking like this coming out of an NTSB investigation for months and months and months.
That's right, and that's the advantage here. It's ghoulish, but we get to see what happened, and I don't know if people can appreciate how severe a turn that is on an aircraft that big, and to go from 456 to 340 in terms of speed while turning. It must have been an emergency, and of course now we know. David, we'll return to this topic in 1 second. Hold there with me.
Okay.
We're learning the first of the president's comments from, again, he is at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. George W. Bush says the U.S. military is on high alert at home and abroad. And as eerie as it is to have to say this, but we have to say this on a day like today, the president is ensuring Americans that he has taken steps to ensure the functioning of the U.S. government. George W. Bush says freedom itself was attacked and freedom will be protected. Barksdale is near Shreveport, Louisiana, and we're joined, David Stempler, stay with us. We're joined by Bill Arkin, our MSNBC military consultant. Bill, why Barksdale?
Well, Barksdale is an old Strategic Air Command base, which is now the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. It is the closest air facility, and for that matter, the closest military base to Florida, where you would have the full command center and the strategic nuclear capabilities of the United States. And I don't mean to raise the nuclear issues, but what you have at Barksdale is all of the communications that would support links to every aspect of the U.S. national security complex.
Bill, you mentioned, of course, the ultimate here, and in trying to get to this studio, I encountered several people who were expressing emotions that have not been heard out loud in this country since the last time the United States was attacked on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. There is a growing sentiment. You hear it anecdotally. You hear it in the media. Tremendous anger, of course, at whoever has done this. And how long can the military wait? How long will they be willing to wait to make sure the U.S. knows just who it's hitting back here?
Well, I think that there's really not much question as to who is responsible for these attacks. There are not very many terrorist organizations in the world that have the networks and the organization and the finances to put something like this so sophisticated together. So though there are 28 terrorist organizations listed in the State Department's Patterns of Global Terrorism report for 2001, there's really only one organization, Osama bin Laden's organization, Al-Qaeda, which has really the ability to do this, and they also have a long history from 1992 when they targeted U.S. troops in Yemen to the embassy bombings in August 1998, of where they have clearly focused their attention on U.S. targets. The problem is that obviously you don't carry out an attack like this and then sit at home waiting for cruise missiles to arrive. I imagine Osama bin Laden and his command structure have also gone underground as part of this overall attack, as would any terrorist organization, even if it's not the Al-Qaeda group. And so I think that you have two problems in mounting military retaliation. One is that retaliation itself has to be in accordance with American laws and standards. We can't just attack any terrorist organization and then say that makes us feel better. We have to do something which is both legal and which is proportionate to what has occurred. And then secondly, we have to have a target. There has to be an actual target that is suitable to attack. And I think that as the intelligence establishment now sorts through information and tries to figure out the source of the attack and the locations of those cells which were responsible for this attack, we're going to see probably very swift action, because I can't imagine that the Bush administration is going to respond to this by saying that this is a law enforcement matter.
Bill, when you look at what has happened today, is there any benchmark? Is this the new benchmark for the intelligence failure of all time?
Oh, come on, Brian. The reality here is that we spend $30 billion a year on intelligence, and we do not have a clue. Americans should be absolutely horrified and angry today that our entire airline security system broke down, our entire counterterror organization broke down, and our intelligence establishment was sitting there at 8:59 this morning, probably looking at every country in the world, at every armed force, at every issue, and not focusing their attention on something that they should have had warning about.
This brings us back to David Stempler. David, 4 people, and perhaps more than that, got on 4 commercial flights this morning, diverted them, killed themselves and everyone on board. What does that mean to you? Have we lost David Stempler?
Brian?
Yes, David.
Yes. I don't know how we can assess this at this point, and I'll tell you why. What we have and the kind of domestic airline security that we have is really set up to manage a hijacking situation using metal-type weapons, whether it's guns or knives. I talked with a security colleague this morning. What could have happened is you could have put 10, 15, 20 people on this airplane. They could have overpowered any amount of people without any guns or any weapons. But I would assume that what has happened here is that these were not the pilots, the American or United Airlines pilots. I believe that those pilots were taken out somehow and placed in the seats were these terrorist pilots who actually focused on these buildings. So I don't know how you deal with that kind of threat assessment at this point.
It's been theorized that because of just how these planes acted today, that it would have taken more, even than someone with a gun to the